We're continuing with the messengers of the Advent message. Who were they? We already talked about William Miller and Joseph Bates. There were some other people that sometimes are not even included in our main teaching of Adventist history. One of them is Joseph Wolf, but he is mentioned in the Great Controversy, and he was a tremendous missionary. He's not only a missionary to America or to Africa. He was known to be the missionary to the world. I will read to you the list of countries that he says he went through, just for you to have an idea how wide was his preaching, how wide was the extent of his travels and his work. In 1831, he was sent as a missionary from Great Britain to labor among the Jews of Palestine. Now remember, this man was a Jew who got converted. First, he became a Catholic, then he became Anglican, and then he was sent as a missionary. But above all that, he was preaching about the coming of Jesus. He was announcing to the world that the coming of Jesus was very soon. He proclaimed the Lord's speedy advent in, and then here's the list of countries. Let's just read through them to have an idea of where he went through. Palestine, Egypt, on the shores of the Red Sea, Mesopotamia, which is today's Iraq, the Crimea, you know where that is, the Black Sea, Persia, Georgia, and it's not talking about the state of Georgia, it's the country Georgia. Throughout the Ottoman Empire, remember the Ottoman Empire that we have been looking at? It was alive and well, almost well, not quite well at that point. It was about to go out, but it was still alive. In Greece, Arabia, Turkey, Bukhara, Afghanistan, Kashmir, Hindustan, Tibet, in Holland, Scotland, Ireland, at Constantinople, Jerusalem, St. Helena, also on shipboard in the Mediterranean, and in New York City, to all denominations. But remember, there was another place that he didn't even mention here, which was in the United States Congress. He actually preached there about the coming of Jesus. Do you understand what that means? It meant that God was telling the whole world through His people, through His chosen agents. He was telling the whole world that Christ was soon coming. So when you announce something to the legislative body of the country, that is a big thing. And he was invited to speak at Congress. And he preached there that Jesus was coming soon. He declares that he has preached among Jews, Turks, Mohammedans, Parsis, Hindus, Chaldeans, Yazidis, Syrians, Sabaeans, to Pashas sheikhs, Shahs, the king of the kings of Oregonst and Bukhara, the queen of Greece, etc. In Yemen, the region inhabited by the descendants of Hobab, Moses' father-in-law, Joseph Wolf saw a book which he thus speaks. The Arabs of this place have a book called Sirah, which treats of the second coming of Christ and his reign in glory. And that's from his mission to the Bukhara book, or to Bukhara. Try to get the import of this. We read in the Bible about Moses. He was the first author in the Bible. Is that right? He wrote the first few books. In there we read of Moses' father-in-law, Hobab. And now, how many thousand years later? 3,500 years later, here comes a missionary to Yemen, and he finds those same people that Moses talked about, the descendants of Hobab. How amazing is that? And they have a book called Sirah, which talk about the speedy coming of Christ, the coming of Christ in His glory, the second coming. So they knew, and many people knew, that Christ was coming a second time. In Yemen, He spent 6 days with the Rechabites. Now, we move forward here to the future, after the time of Moses, maybe 700 years after Moses. And the Bible talks about the Rechabites. You remember that, right? We already talked about it. When they were still keeping the command of Jonadab, the son of Rechab, that they should not drink wine, that they should inhabit tents and plant no vineyards. And look what Loughborough says regarding Joseph Wolf. He says, in Yemen, he spent 6 days with the Rechabites, of whom he says, they drink no wine, plant no vineyards, sow no seed, live in tents, and remember the words of Jonadab, the son of Rechab. With them were the children of Israel, of the tribe of Dan, who reside near Tarim in Hadramaut, who expect in common with the children of Rechab the speedy arrival of the Messiah in the clouds of heaven. Were they expecting His first coming? No. They are Israelites of the tribe of Dan, and they expect the second coming of Christ in the clouds of heaven. That, for me, is so amazing. We see from the above that in those 14 years, Wolf himself had proclaimed the news of Christ's coming at the doors in more than 20 different nations. During the same time, the doctrine was extensively agitated in Germany, particularly in the south among the Moravians. So here you have a few illustrations of how he was going about, with the Arabs there on the left. In the center, you have the title page of his book. This is actually the book he wrote. The Travels and Adventures of the Reverend Joseph Wolf. And it is amazing. If you read Great Controversy, she cites the travels and the experience he had. And Loughborough also does that. So it's an amazing person. And he was preaching around the world at the same time that Miller was preaching. You understand, Miller was preaching to the United States. There were other people around the world preaching the same message. Another person here, another of the messengers, Josiah Litch. He read Miller's lectures, published in 1836, and was convicted of Miller's position, but resisted impression to preach it in case it did not come to pass. So he was, as we would say, a little careful, right? Maybe too careful, because he was convicted. He had a dream that persuaded him to be willing to bear reproach for Christ, and began preaching and writing about the doctrine. And he's considered to be the first well-known minister to take up Millerite teaching, and first to join Miller in his work. Because Himes was in 1839, and Charles Fitch only joined in 1841. He wrote an article in June entitled "The Probability of the Second Coming of Christ" about AD 1843, predicting the fall of the Ottoman Empire based on Revelation 9, awakening much interest in the northeastern part of the United States. This was Josiah Litch. In Great Controversy, you also read about him. And as we saw already, he was the one that predicted that the Ottoman Empire would fall. In what day? We must remember this. August 11, 1840. Remember that? It was after the 391 years and 15 days. We must remember that. Those are special prophecies that help us to understand where we are. August 11, 1840 is when he understood that Ottoman Empire would fall, and it happened exactly like the prediction said. And in Great Controversy, Ellen White calls this a remarkable fulfillment of prophecy. She says, in the year 1840, another remarkable fulfillment of prophecy took place or happened. Another person here, we have Joshua Himes. This was considered to be the publisher of William Miller because he was a minister, but he had a great talent in publishing. And he was a go person. He was a reformer. He espoused the causes such as abolitionism, that means anti-slavery, pacifism, education, and temperance. He attended Miller's lectures on the Charlton Street in Boston, the church there. These were Miller's first lectures in a major city, given twice a day. The interest was so great that hundreds had to be turned away. After Miller's lectures, Himes met with Miller and joined him in the cause as its prime mover, opening doors to other Christian churches in the large cities and editing and publishing. Francis D. Nichol described his method as action and on a large scale and without delay. So that's how Himes was. It's interesting to see the way he met Miller and joined him. Miller preached and he was convicted by Miller's preaching. Then he comes to Miller, I don't know if it was right after the service or he invited Miller to go home to speak to him. And he said, Mr. Miller, do you really believe what you preach? What you're teaching us? And Miller said, of course I believe, otherwise I wouldn't be teaching it. And he said, what are you doing to spread this to the world? And Miller responded, I'm doing all I can. I need help. I asked for help, but nobody's helping. Then we're told that Joshua Himes said, prepare the campaign. We will enter into every major city of the United States. And in fact, that's about what they did. They went everywhere preaching and entering major cities like Boston, New York, and other cities. So Miller was the person that was teaching, but the main person behind all the publishing, which exponentially grew the message, the extent of the message, was Joshua Himes. In 1839, he became a convert to the Advent cause, as expounded by the famous elder William Miller. He entered the new cause with all the enthusiasm he possessed, and his ministrations were full of fire and power. In 1840, he began the publication of the Signs of the Times. Is that familiar? It's amazing. We still have it today. He was the person who published that magazine the first. Then when that was done, another of the Adventist people started or restarted its publications. But Joshua Himes was the one that probably coined the name, not invented the name, but coined the name for a magazine. Because the Signs of the Times, the word appears in the Bible, right? So he didn't invent that, but to use it in the magazine, I think he was the first one to do that. So he began in 1840 the publication of the Signs of the Times, advocating the cause into which he had thrown his whole heart. All his money, all his labor, all his energy were thrown into the lap of this cause, just like Joseph Bates, as we read yesterday, remember? As we saw yesterday. Joseph Bates spent all his money to the point of saying, this was the last money I had on earth, when he bought the 4 pounds of flour. So Joshua Himes did exactly the same thing. He spent all his money into this cause, and thousands of converts were won. The great physical force of Elder Himes preserved him till he entered his 92nd year. And I wanted to pay attention to this thing that I'll mention next. Quite amazing. His faculties of mind were vigorous to the last. In the year 1894, how many years after the disappointment? 50 years later, right? 50 years after, he gave a most stirring discourse to a congregation of over 3,000 Seventh-day Adventists on the campground in Lansing, Michigan. He seemed to speak with much of the earnestness and vigor of olden days. 50 years later, he's speaking to a congregation of Seventh-day Adventists. 3,000 people, and very excited about it, just 2 years before he died. He published this. Have you seen this? The Millennial Harp. This was the hymn book of the Millerites, published in 1843. Look at this. Millennial Harp, designed for meetings on the second coming of Christ. Improved edition. 3 parts in 1 volume. Boston, 1843. Published by Joshua Himes. If you see the hymns that are found here, oh, you feel so touched. Some are being sung now. We have some of these in our hymn books.